So we were looking around at what topics might be appropriate, and as Neil commented on in his report, we've done quite a bit of work on consultations recently, and there were some documents that came out over the last few months that I thought were quite interesting and worth sharing. And these have come from or are associated with Scottish and Southern Energy, and they weren't necessarily produced by them, but they were commissioned by SSE. So I thought that it would be hopefully interesting to take you through them and pull out some of the key points that I've observed by having a look through them, and they kind of touch on some of the issues that I think we have with our energy system as a community. And it's just probably no surprise that it's not coming out with a glowing report. There might be some observations that OREF might want to make, and part of presenting it here today was just to get some extra feedback and see what you thought might be appropriate. So if this is still working. Yeah. So I've got just 3 or 4 slides to kind of get us into Orkney's energy system at the start. And, you know, the transition is still our greatest challenge. I think at this time, with the election impending, we've got all our minds on all the other troubles that we have in our country, which are not inconsiderable. But, you know, they don't change that climate imperative. So we need to deal with the poverty, the health, the cash crisis, all the other things. But we still can't lose sight of that energy challenge. And to manage and implement that transition, we need certain things. So we first of all need to think of the scope. What does that energy transition encompass? Where are we on that transition? And obviously that changes year by year, week by week. We need to perhaps understand how we've got to where we are, because that's really important then looking forward, because it maybe helps us understand how we take the next steps. And we learned the lessons from the things that were really, really tough so far, which are considerable. And then we need to think about where we need and want to get to. So what's our ultimate target? Where are we jumping to? And then evaluate the possible pathways to those destinations. Select the best one of those and start on that journey, and marshal the resources to then follow it. So, I mean, that's a pretty standard, logical way of dealing with things. And I just thought it's worthwhile, I always like reminding myself of what the easy stuff is, because then when we're looking at what plans other people are putting in front of us, it's maybe helpful to think, are those plans meeting those logical steps? So just some highlights for Orkney. And, you know, we are an archipelago of 17 islands, 22,000 people. We've been a major energy hub for the UK since 1974, when the Flotter oil terminal opened, and that's handled 10% of UK's oil production over the last nearly 50 years. And not actually due to Flotter, but because of all the other things we do with energy, we have the highest, or one of the highest per capita emissions of carbon dioxide in the country. In the 90s, we were actually the worst. In the recent trends, by 2010, we were the 20th worst. So out of 420 local authorities, we were 400th. And in 2020, we were still 400th. So we hadn't actually climbed that comparative ladder on a per capita basis. Now that's despite all the good stuff we've done with decarbonising electricity, and it just shows the domination that we still have for oil and gas in our energy economy. And we've had these different eras where, you know, in the 80s, the real renewables revolution was kicked off with Burger Hill becoming a test centre for wind turbines. We explored the art of the feasible in the 2000s. We then moved on to implementing the art of the possible in the 2010s. And we reached that Rubicon of getting our renewables, our electricity, all provided by renewable sources in 2013. 100% equivalent. And what I think we've done since then is we looked at hydrogen and storage, and then since and through COVID, we looked at how these different parts could be integrated into one system that can then be part of the transition. And then I think in the last few years, maybe those previous decades, we've been quite internally focused. What's happened in the last few years is the advent of ScotWind and the INTOG offshore wind leasing rounds. They've introduced an outside focus because people are planning to invest something like £20 billion in the waters in and around Orkney over the next 10 years. And that's going to have a profound effect on us or not on us, depending on how we manage to capture some of that investment. Now, we're not going to focus on that today, but you'll see that one of the things that the SSE work hasn't done is it hasn't thought about offshore wind. So many of you, hopefully all of you, have seen this and you have it emblazoned in your memory that on our energy Sankey diagram, the green box in the middle there is electricity, and that's the bit that we've decarbonised, and that equates to about 15% of our energy system. The other 85% is still carbon full. So we have a huge job still to do. And one of the things that's unique about islands, in particular in Orkney as well, is that it's largely a transport issue. 80% of our energy is used in transportation. So that's where we need to focus. And Neil and I did a presentation to Ofgem a couple of years ago, and I came up with this idea of snakes and ladders, which seemed to epitomise our lives in OREF. And Neil's kind of account talks about the, what we've achieved and what we've then slid down. And, many of us have been up ladders and then slid down snakes. So if we look at some of the opportunities that exist, some of the things that have been the ladders, we've got rich resources, we've got an engaged community, we've got a progressive supply chain, a track record that's really, fantastic, diverse energy situations, and a scale to achieve change without it becoming overwhelming. But we then have the issues such as the tariffs that we have for energy, the level of connectivity to the islands, locational charging strategies. We're often off the strategy map, literally. And we're exceptional, we're not average. Most of the UK's policies are governed by the average. There's policy instability. We have a disengaged DNO, and there's a need for greater flexibility in regulations. And these are things that OREF has been pretty consistent in canvassing over and communicating about for the last 20 years. I did include this one because I think it's always important to hold on to hope. And despite that backdrop, and perhaps because of that backdrop, I think what Orkney has done is it's created, not by design, but almost by accident, a structure of being able to do things when it wants to do things and it motivates itself to do things. And this slide is something that we've come back to again and again to look at the structure from creating a vision through to making that into a strategy, into creating the organisational structures that allows the whole community to contribute, and then down into the involvement of organisations, the action of individuals, and the support that we get from all of us as citizens of Orkney. And if we're going to do change, we have to think about change at all of those levels and with all of those different players involved. So, then we come on to the meat of the presentation, SSE. So, SSE, the hydro, as it was known, we've got a number of relationships with SSE. It was and is a long-term electricity supply and energy network company. Until recently, it was most of our energy supplier, but during COVID, it sold the business to OVO, and that was probably heralded by the fact that they foresaw the energy crisis coming and basically bailed out. And I think for a company that had 90% loyalty of customers in Orkney, that was pretty unforgivable measure, really. It's still a distribution network operator. So we have a relationship with SSE because they manage the constrained grid that we have on Orkney. It's been constrained for over 20 years, and that hasn't changed. And they're also the steward of the Orkney A&M scheme, and I'll come back to that as well. SSE are also the transmission network operator, so they're currently, as Neil pointed out, constructing the Finstown substation. And they have a renewables division, which owns the Spurness wind farm on Sandy. So they're the biggest kind of external, well, actually, before Barry sold out, they would have been, but Barry's turbines probably, the company that took them over, maybe they're now the biggest external owner of Orkney Wind, but they were before that. They've previously leased areas of the sea under the Pentland Firth Orkney Waters leasing round. They've invested in some wave and tidal technologies, and they have interests in offshore wind. So they're a diverse company. One of the challenges is that when they come and speak to us, they don't come and speak to us as SSE. They come and speak to us either as SSEN or SHEPD or I have to say this, SHET, that's it, that's how they say it. It's very close to another word, but anyhow, or SSN renewables. So in the last few months and years, there's been a number of studies that have been done relating to SSE, and these studies have all been done by a company called Regen, which is based in Exeter in Devon, and they go back to 2022 and 2021, when a first study was looking at the distribution of future energy scenarios in the north of Scotland. You can see that on the left-hand side. There was then an update to that in 2022-23, which was looking at the same thing, but hopefully better. And then there's a series now of localized reports that have come out, which are looking at the islands, Shetland, Western Isles, Orkney. So I'm just going to talk through the Orkney one at the moment. Now, each of these reports is pretty meaty. They're 150 pages long, and they've got a lot in there. Some of it's interesting, some of it might be true. All of it is going to probably affect us. So, yeah, it's worth paying attention. So in this report, what I've done is I've just stripped out pages to show you this is what is actually in the report, and then I've overlaid it in red with some comments that help me keep track of what I want to say about things. So the first is the purpose of the report. So it explains what it's about and why they've undertaken it, and it's effectively to provide an evidence base for SSEN's wider cost-benefit analysis to feed into the dialogue with Ofgem by January 2025. So in a way, that sounds really good. They're looking for evidence about investment in our energy system for the future. So big tick. What we would hope then is that the evidence is appropriate, that it reflects our reality, and that therefore the system we might get out of it is what we need and want. We'll get to the end and decide that. So the methodology is outlined here. It basically just shows a lot of links from the reports that I've outlined and how they flow through to each other. I'm not going to labour that. Within the executive summary, I've said there's a good start. There's some words here which, other than the fact that they ascribe the Sustainable Energy Strategy to Orkney Island Council only, instead of it being a community plan, the rest of it seems pretty okay. They're talking about, at least they acknowledge that there's a strategy and that it outlines an ambition to reach net zero by 2030, which is something that locally isn't always recognised, so it's great to see SSE actually recognising that. And then it talks about the commitments that are being made and some of the assets that have been included. And then at the bottom it says, the broader analysis, research and engagement suggests a significant future electricity load growth in the Orkney. Our electricity load will grow. Yes, I think we can all agree that. and there's a significant market and community interest in unexploited resources and driving further distributed generation. So that's a good point. I think that would be something that would be aligned with ORF. Further on in the baseline, what they then start to do is look at the existing network infrastructure, and it basically describes what we have at the moment. But if you see in red there, it doesn't mention the fact that for the last 20 or 30 years, we've had our EVs to Finstown saggy wires, which is the reason why we have a constrained grid. And it doesn't mention any of the other system weaknesses, which obviously we've endured recently with the cable failures, both to the mainland and between Shappensea and Edy. I think it was that cable that went. And it also doesn't mention the fact that when they replaced the Orkney Thurso grid connection, instead of attaching the two new cables and leaving the third one in place still, they took away the old one, and then one of the new ones immediately broke. So instead of having 3 and getting 2 from 3, we ended up with 2 and only having 1 from 2. So I think this is where it feels to me that we start to lose a bit of touch with reality, because the information base isn't quite reflecting the reality that we have internally. They then talk a little bit about network constraints and reinforcements, and they talk about the active network management system. And this is something that was asked for by ORF back in 2002. It was eventually delivered in 2009, and it describes that SSEN and Smarter Grid Solutions, basically installed and delivered an active network management system. And again, it just feels a bit disingenuous that it doesn't reflect the fact that it was Orkney's idea. I think it was Colin Risbridger, actually, who sat down in the Orca Hotel in Stromness with SSE and discussed it. The willingness for the island generators to support it commercially, and the investment that was made in the comms, and the risk of the non-firm connection. So all of the people that are on A&M don't have a direct firm route to market, and as we know, some of the community turbines have really suffered because their generation has been curtailed down to 50 or 60% at times of what it could and should be. So again, if we're trying to build a baseline understanding, if we don't have that kind of insight, is that important? There is then a page about the Orkney Net Zero strategy, which is largely okay. It seems to be aligned with what's happening. There's then an inventory of wind turbines, and one of the things that the study kind of talks about is that since the Bury turbine and the Spurness wind farm are reaching 18 years old, they're getting towards the time when repowering might be thought about, or replacement of the turbines. And what they also kind of touch on a little bit is the firming up of connections, and the importance of that is that if you have a firm connection, you need to have a guaranteed route to market, so you have 2 levels of connection. If you have a non-firm connection, you just have the 1 cable. So most firm connections have 2 cables, so you've got redundancy. Now that's something that probably as an island we would quite appreciate, because it gives us more security of supply. It also doesn't mention microgeneration, so the small wind turbines are ignored. It doesn't mention household storage, and it doesn't mention heat pumps. So all of that capacity is not included in the assessment. So I'll just maybe pause there on the baseline stuff. And I know this is quite difficult to assimilate and feed back on, but is there, in terms of the sentiment and the types of comments I've made there, in terms of trying to give them a better insight into the reality of the baseline, does that feel like an appropriate approach that ORF should follow? Is there anybody that feels we shouldn't be as nitpicky and we should just leave them unaware of what's going on? Yeah. Oh.
I can't see how they would know how much electricity Orkney is going to use in the future based on that superficial few pages about what Orkney Islands Council said. And I'd have thought, as you said at the beginning, transport is Orkney's major challenge. But how on earth would SSE have any clue as to how much energy could be, how much electrical energy could be used to drive the ships, which I presume are the main consumer?
No, absolutely. Very good points. You'll see as we go on, we come closer to that. So I think we'll just lodge that as endorsement and move on. Yeah, Keith.
Does anybody know what the farming industry
It helps our online audience.
Thank you. Yes, does anybody know what the farming industry contributes to the overall energy use in Orkney? It must be a huge amount, considering the size of the tractors and machinery they use nowadays. And I just wonder if anybody's given any thought to that. And are there any solutions?
So as Orkney, we know about that because the last energy audits that we did looked at like red diesel usage through agricultural purposes as a specific category. We've also started to look more recently at things like fertilizer and the energy that's brought into agriculture in that mechanism. And under the ICNZ project, there's some growing focus now on better quantification of these things. So people are looking at them. In terms of the solutions, I think the vehicles, as far as I'm aware, and I haven't studied this in great detail, but obviously there are hydrogen vehicles on the market. There are electric-driven vehicles that are on the market. With both of those, the availability of either the electricity in the fields or the hydrogen in anywhere is still a challenge. So I don't think the solution has been settled, but clearly, and there's also things like the biodiesel and the synthetic fuels as well. So if Neil was here, he would be probably looking towards some of the synthetic fuel work that Pete Oswald did and the potential solution that might herald for that particular sector. So the report does look at the transmission links, and one of the things which isn't just relating to SSE, it's influenced by Ofgem, is that the transmission part of the business and the country's strategic planning and the distribution side don't really speak to each other. And so here it outlines that the capacity of the new cable is probably going to be no less than 220 megawatts, but the approved capacity which allowed it to be put in place is 135. So there's 100 megawatts of extra capacity that could be put on it. But there are people already putting through wind applications and tidal applications to use some of that capacity up. So yeah, it's an interesting question of how big that cable should have been to meet Orkney's future energy demands. And what was interesting to me is that they haven't looked really at the links between these three things. So increased local demand, if we use more energy as agricultural use or cars or boats locally, we don't then need to transmit it offshore to the UK, to Scotland. And if we produce more locally, we don't need to import it. So that size of the link is determined not just by what you're producing, but how you use it. And then if we had local storage is an alternative to a transmission connection, if we were putting energy we produce locally into a battery, we can use that to offset the times when you would be drawing down on the transmission. And what's the available trans? I obviously stopped thinking in the middle of a word there. Local storage.
I was going to make a comment.
Your microphone is coming, sir.
I happened to be speaking to the SSEN project, something or other, for the cable last week, and I asked him what happens if we need a bigger cable, and he said we just put another one beside the existing one. So they are thinking about increasing it in the future.
So, yes, the practicalities of that are unfortunately not necessarily thought about because the cable track, particularly from the sea to the substation, is only going to be built for one set of cables. So it's absolutely it's true. We need to future-proof it. And the other point I think I was trying to get to, but I obviously got distracted, was that there are possibilities for offshore wind farms to land in Orkney and then use our cables to export the energy from here. But at the moment, there's none of that thinking that's been incorporated into it. But I think this, again, is something that OREF should be championing is, and I said in the list of how you go through things, what is our ultimate aim? So if we look to 2050 or 2040, what does our energy system look like then, and how could that work? And basically how many conduits or lines do we need to be thinking about? As I mentioned, in terms of battery storage, there's quite a lot of description about how battery storage works, but it says that there's no existing household battery storage in Orkney. For those of you that have batteries, obviously that's probably something that is obviously not true. And I think the irony of, as many of you will know, the Reflex story, that Reflex tried to put batteries into people's homes on a collective basis, and we were blocked by SSE from doing it. And that led to the Glaswegian guys called Solar Dynamics coming in and installing perhaps 200 systems through Orkney. So we have 200 battery solar systems which are not acknowledged on here. So where that takes us to are towards the end of their report, they start to then build up all of this baseline that they've understood into a scenario. And so this basically is the graph of total installed capacity over the period from the baseline, where they're saying at the moment we're about 75 megawatts of capacity, through to 2050. So it's a bit like find Where's Wally? You have to find the deliberate mistakes in the graph. So I think one of the things that struck me was that they've said in their report that we've agreed to set a target for 2030 as our net zero target. So that would suggest that in 2030 you want to be at that height on the graph. But what they're suggesting is that we've only got to 60% of our net zero target by 2030. So already that displaces on a timeline the transformation that's needed. The other factors on here is that this blue wedge is associated with marine energy, and you'll know how much a champion I've been of marine energy, but I do question whether we're going to be able to install that amount of marine energy in those timescales. And on the battery side, they don't have any existing battery storage, and they see a relatively low level of battery capacity coming in. And given our isolation and the variability in our demand, it seems to me, and particularly if there's tidal energy, which immediately lends itself to storage capacity, it seems inconceivable that we'll only have that amount of storage in our system. So on that graph, and the other thing is that it ignores offshore wind. There's no offshore wind contribution. So this is getting towards the conclusions of the report, and this is the energy scenario that SSE are going to go to Ofgem with to develop their grid whatever development plans. So so that's one part of it. The other part, so this relates to some of what they call the disruptive technology adoption. So in this one, there's this blue color here, which is hydrogen electrolysis. Now there's a significant amount of hydrogen electrolysis envisaged by 2025. So that's equivalent to about maybe 10 or 15 megawatts. So that's 10 times what EMEC have got at the moment when it's working on ED. And then over the time span, it only increases by 2 times from 2025. So it feels to me that that's probably too much too soon, but then it doesn't grow at an appropriate rate, because if we prove that hydrogen's viable, as Keith was saying, what are we going to do with agriculture? What are we going to do with boats and all these other things? And if we just read for hydrogen electrolysis, like clean fuel production, because we don't know that it's going to be hydrogen, clean fuel production, because we don't know that it's going to be hydrogen that's the solution. It might be ammonia, it might be some other fuel. Then only seeing it grow by 2 times over that period seems very low. The other thing, and this relates to the adoption pace, is that this is their foreseen electrical chargers for vehicles. So the green is domestic chargers, and the whatever color is non-domestic. And what they're showing is that by 2030 we'll only have 30% of the EV chargers that they're anticipating that we're going to have in place. Now obviously that's misaligned with achieving net zero by 2030, and it's probably not very representative of the pace at which EV growth's going. And also the distribution between domestic chargers and non-domestic chargers is probably wrong as well. We probably have a greater proportion of non-domestic chargers. So those are quite specific observations. Does anybody see other things, disagree with them, agree with them? Does that seem a logical analysis of what they've presented? Let's just do it as a show. Does anybody feel that where we're going with this is inappropriate? Does anybody feel it's appropriate? Go on. Some engagement would be good, folks. Who doesn't care anymore? Right. Very close to the end now. So there is a ray of hope in the report, because there is this passage which is basically talking about the links between transmission and distribution and the benefits of engagement with the local community. And obviously, we haven't had a huge amount of engagement through this process yet. I don't think OREF has even been officially notified that these reports exist. There's a mixed bag of summary stuff which is just a bit simplistic. I won't go through that. And I'll maybe finish on this other issues thing. So basically, as you talked about, is it Peter? David, yeah. There's no attempt to quantify maritime emissions and those factors. For me, one of the most important things is that given we're an archipelago where logistics are absolutely key, there's no attempt to distribute this load across the islands. It just says this is Orkney. So given the focus on transport, you can't follow where housing is to necessarily know where your energy load is going to be, because your transport nodes are going to be important as well. In the projections, there's no consideration of seasonal or extreme scenarios in terms of capacity, so it just gives an average. And it doesn't actually say what the capacity is, it just says it's a number. And there's no consideration of demand fluctuations over the day and how we balance that. There's also no consideration of resilience to power outages. One of the things that we all need to deal with is that as we become more dependent on electricity, you can have a power cut, and that power cut then affects everything that's influenced by electricity. So if you think through to some of the winter times we've had maybe 3 days without power, if you have 3 days without electricity and your transport and everything is reliant on that, that's a real problem. When you have the petrol-based system, you don't actually have a power cut, if you like, in petrol, so you always have that as a backup. It does look as though the authors were engaged to an extent with OIC and EMEC, but I think they were the only people that were contacted in the build-up of this report, and there's no local engagement. And I think one of the things that ORF and indeed the council policy talks about in terms of sustainable energy is about jobs in Orkney, and ORF has been an absolute engine for trying to encourage people to support local business, local industry, local community groups, so that we have a stake in what's going on. And again, there's another £150,000 worth of work that's been done here, which actually doesn't have any Orkney involvement in it again. So that professional engagement just isn't happening. And I think from an SSE perspective, I still don't think we've actually been visited by any senior management on the islands for the last 20 years. So it feels like we're just a backwater to SSE, and I think as ORF maybe we do need to start making ourselves a bit more obvious and saying, as a good steward of our energy system, if you want the license to operate, you have to engage with us and support us. So the point of bringing this to you was that, like every consultation, it's good to get an idea that we're speaking on behalf of everybody. If it's like just one or two people with a view and the other people have a different view, that doesn't work. So if anybody's got any overall or specific comments where they feel, in particular if you feel this isn't aligned with where ORF should be heading in terms of comments, then it's really, really helpful to know. Come and speak to me afterwards if you don't want to do it in the forum. But I hope it's given you a little bit of insight into some of the studies, if that's the right word, that are going on into our energy future. I was going to say on our behalf. I don't feel it's on our behalf because we weren't asked for it to be done in this way, but it's certainly been imposed on us. So it's good to think about that, and it just shows the fight we need to keep fighting, I'm afraid. Any questions or points from people? Yep. Norman.
Am I right in saying that OIC and EMIC have been contacted by SSE about the loads in Orkney and the wind power in Orkney?
I think it was Regen that contacted them. They were the consultants that did the work. And I think it was more about, from the way the report's written, it sounds like somebody had a Teams meeting and just said, what are you doing? kind of thing. It's that kind of consultation. It's not what I would call deep and meaningful, but it's obvious that they've had a conversation with those two organisations.
Because that's not very accurate at all if they're not involved in solar, small solar and wind and batteries, like miles out.
Yeah.
Why would they not get in touch with ORF, the OIC, EMEC, they know about ORF, they know about small wind in Orkney, they know about solar panels and that, it's poor.
And I think what's worrying to me is that if you understand Orkney as an energy system, you would know that microgeneration was really important. We have the highest uptake in microgeneration in the country. We've got 760 wind turbines, probably another 200 solar installations, another 1,000 heat pumps. These are really important uptake figures. And if you're designing our system and you don't even realize that you've got a mistake of that scale, to me it really raised the question.
Well, they're talking to their own people.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not talking to their own people, they're talking to nobody other than EMEC and OIC. I think that's the problem. And so what ORF can do about it, I think, Gareth, you're right at the end when you're suggesting that we should be looking for somebody senior to come here and discuss, because as you know, all of us have had various meetings with SSE over the years, and they're clever with their consultation, because they pick different people to come at different times, and they split it up into different levels, so you end up speaking to a wee bit about distribution and they say that's nothing to do with us, it's all transmission and they're not here, and then you speak to transmission and they say distribution is not here, or shit here, whatever they are, and it needs something, and that should be something maybe that we could do as OREF, is put that effort back probably through our MP or something, because it'll take some kind of kick like that to get these guys to come out of there. Because they do just things you mentioned in the beginning about us being exceptional rather than the average, and what they see in their spreadsheets and their financial projections will all be about averages and not about us. But then equally we're plastered all over the papers about being the powerhouse of, between us and Shetland and the Western Isles, this is where the energy is. So somebody's got to wake up and do that, and we should be asking whoever our MP is after the election in the next wee while, that should be a priority of them, to make sure that guy or these people come here and we sit down and discuss exactly that kind of detail with them.
There was as some of you may remember, the Sustainable Energy Strategy was a joint strategy that OREF, CES, the Council embarked on in 2017, and we've kept a working group going since that time. It's been quite infrequent, but the last meeting was about 3 months ago, and Neil Kermode and I went on behalf of OREF, and actually that point came up because the question said, how can we engage with SSE? And Neil and I both said that what we have to do is get a chief executive up here, requested by the chief executive of the council to attend, to come for 2 days and have a full session to understand the level of angst and concern that there is in the community, because all the messages that we constantly put in are just not getting through. So I think that, and I mean, I'm not saying that shouldn't be the MP as well, but definitely we need to up the ante. Because the level of investment, for the last 20 years, SSE hasn't really invested anything in Orkney. That's why we've still got the saggy wires. That was a step too far. Now they're investing £500 million in a new transmission connection, but we're still not getting any focused attention from the company. So.
Would there be any scope in OREF and any equivalent in Shetland and the Western Isles, perhaps ganging up as a islands thing to get something along those lines done? And it's almost like a Highlands and Islands level thing might be, or at least an islands level thing might be more a bigger chunk for somebody like that to respond to.
Yeah, so I think there's a plus and there's maybe a minus on that. Yes. So through ICNZ, which is under the Islands deal, that is Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles working together for the first time. And so that's possibly an avenue that could be followed. The negative side is that when Orkney and Shetland and the Western Isles have tried to engage on transmission connections and things like that, Shetland has become a bit blinded by the Viking project. Mm-hmm. And so they've always taken a bit of a different line and followed their own destiny. Yeah. So in this area, it's quite difficult, I think, for Shetland. Although now that they've separated, it might be, because SSE are now taking on Viking project on their own, it might be easier.
Yeah, I was listening to everything that you've said, and I was conscious too that I hadn't engaged with the net zero Orkney, this Foresights Way forward, that I think there's comments invited by the 9th of June or something like that, but I take it that was what emanated for the workshop that we had last year and went into the Orkney partnership, and that's where we're at, and there seems to be just a complete level of disengagement on that, and if we can't get SSE even one bit interested in what our actual plans are, when we talked at that workshop about the need to scale up the workforce in Orkney to get beyond a business as usual approach, and for a year I don't feel, maybe I've been so busy in the front line supporting folk in the domestic energy section, sector, which, as you say, OVA was took over SSE, and it's been an absolute mess. I mean, I've seen colleagues across the Highlands and Islands basically giving up retiring because of the stress that they've been under, and I've been under my own stresses over the past couple of winters, trying to support folk, and from my point of view, I don't think it'll be any surprise to say that some sort of massive change in ownership of the whole thing needs to be looked at, because at the moment you've given us a pretty bleak picture. I can tell you who bleak the picture is at a domestic level, and I don't see any change coming anytime soon, in the present setup. But depending on who the MP is after the 4th of July, I'd be quite happy to pitch in and help build, relationships there. And I ken that folk in Shetland, I know that, as you say, there's different, agendas possibly there, but the Orkney and Zetland County Council Acts are 50 years old this year, and I don't know if anybody here was at Howie's first presentation when he talked about, the lessons that we can learn there. I think there definitely is, something around, seeking ways to portray what we need to do as solutions to problems that we have, and getting more power share. It will be more difficult now that we have two parliaments to deal with, but the Westminster still retain most of that energy system policy control. So it's something to be done there.
I think this is maybe a really nice place to begin to finish off, because it's going up to the bigger end of the scale. So I think one of the things I was taking heart from was the and people have heard probably me say before, I do think there is a future for Orkney with basically cutting the umbilical to the mainland and actually going it alone and having our own energy system where we have storage embedded in the islands. And if you look at the cost of this transmission cable at £500 million, if you put that into storage, you could get a hell of a battery. and maybe that's a better way of doing it, because it gives us control. So, the skills of maintaining the system are all here. The people that work on the grid are all here. It's only the management that's south. So that's something to think about. And as we go to an integrated energy system where it's not just electricity, it's also fuels, why are SSE the custodian of that? They haven't dealt with fuels ever in their history. Surely we've got a stake in that as islanders. So the other thing that may come about in a few weeks' time is that your Labour's policy is around Great Britain Energy as a new publicly owned entity. It's not clear how that's going to be structured. So is it a regional structure? Is it a national structure? There's quite a lot of pressure for it to be quite devolved. And maybe Orkney should put a case up to be, if you like, the first, we're very good at this, becoming the first area to get set up with a subunit of Great British Energy, if that comes about, to be a devolved energy system. So that's something that we could maybe have a look at as ORF. And I think, just to support you, Rob, that we need to be thinking about that big picture stuff as well as the small picture stuff. David?
The role of the DNO has changed or is changing. I presume you know this, but they're supposed to now be not just taking electricity to the community, but controlling the community to manage the demand. And that report didn't seem to reflect that at all. It just seemed to be saying that's what the community is going to do, so we'll put some wires in to do it. Now, in Orkney, I would have thought the huge thing is storage heat, and how much cheaper is it going to be to store to store heat rather than use electricity when you want it. So I certainly think we should pick them up on that, but then I think we should engage with them and say we can make it better by doing these things, all the things that ORF has been trying to do.
No, that's really good points. And history's always a wonderful learning platform. I remember when SSE put in the moratorium on microwind in 2012, and basically overnight said that we weren't going to allow any more generation to come on the grid. And OREF created a work group, which actually at the time Fergus Ewing endorsed, and basically told SSE they had to work with us. And we came up with 35 solutions. Mark Hull, Colin Risbridger, Ian, you were in the council at the time, I think, and myself and Neil Kermode were all in there. 35 solutions, and they did one, which was to measure the temperature at the point where we have the saggy wires, instead of just taking an average weather forecasting reading. And that was the great investment that SSE made in making our energy system smarter. It was measuring the air temperature at the point where we have the saggy wires. So, yeah, that's... But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try again. We have to, it's like the wibbly wobbly man. You always have to come back up and have another crack at it, I think. So, because I've got to the wibbly wobbly man stage of this, I think we need to stop before it gets any worse. So thank you for going through that, and it's really helpful to get the feedback from people and get a kind of an idea of the sentiment in the room. Because as Neil said in his message and Mark outlined, it's only a consensus that takes us forward. And one of the things that OREF has been really strong with, I think, over the 25 years of our existence, is that we have had a really strong consensual understanding within our membership of what needs to be done. So thank you for your participation.
Thank you, Gareth.